All right, welcome to the Risk Room. It's a live edition of our podcast, Industrial Risk Beyond the Blueprint. I'm Jawanda Joseph, and today we're going to try something a little bit different. We're bringing back a guest to rediscover a conversation that we talked about earlier. If you listened to episode 6, you remember Joe Flood, and you already know the story of the RAND Corporation and how sophisticated computer models led to the burning down of New York City neighborhoods in the 1970s by optimizing for the wrong things in the wrong places. And Joe, it's good to have you back on. How are you?
Great to be back. I'm doing well. Thanks for this. Is my first Substack live. I'm excited.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. I think Substack is trying to turn itself into like a media empire, so maybe we'll be a small part of it. All right, so
Works for me. I should start doing some of my. I've been doing my Substacks. I should start doing some live anyway, since I record them all in one take anyway. Especially, I should just be doing it.
Yeah, you should do them live. I'll log on and watch. All right, so today we're going through another revolution that's not only about algorithms, but artificial intelligence, especially generative AI. And in December 2025, Reuters published a study revealing that major AI companies fail to follow safety standards and that none of them really have a robust strategy for controlling the advanced systems for safety within their models. The finding is striking. So, like frontier AI models are advancing faster than we can really manage, and they could use some constraints and some audit and some change. And this, I think, is even more exacerbated by the news, I think, just earlier this week of Anthropic announcing their Mythos model, where they are kind of restricting its ability to be publicly released because they fear that it would be a risk to software and a risk to safety and cybersecurity. So I guess with all of this news, how are you absorbing this, given what you know and the experience that you have studying RAND Corporation and everything that happened there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the differences are real, but I think a lot of but the similarities and the analogies here are quite striking. I mean, I think that one thing that's so difficult about the current news is just how opaque these systems are with AI models. I mean, the researchers themselves don't entirely understand how any given decision is arrived at in many cases. You can do these sort of like extremely intensive forensic accountings of how it happened. But that's sort of the nature of the model. I think this is an important distinction between AI, generative AI models, and what sort of came before this and the sort of things that Rand was doing, which are deterministic models. Those work based, kind of like your algebra class type stuff. You know what I mean? Like they work the same way over and you ask it the same question. A calculator will always tell you the same answer when you ask it the same question. That is not the way a generative AI model works. It is based on, tokens, which, you're breaking down sentences or whatever it is into like individual pieces. And then based on its training data, which is like sort of the corpus of literature and all these sorts of things, some of which is acquired legally, some of which is not. I believe I'm entitled to a decent chunk of change from multiple LLM companies stealing my book. I have refused to take the money because that's not the deal. You don't get to steal my stuff. I would like my stuff back, please. To steal my stuff and then have some judge say, well, it's worth this much, I guess. There are very few legal realms where that happens. But, I mean, I think that so what happens is, but then it makes a best guess, based on all of the words strung together in its trading data about what's coming next. And that is, that like hallucinations that people talk about, right? Those aren't a bug so much as a feature. It's definitional that when, the answers are going to come out different, they're going to sometimes come out wrong. And so it's a little hard to fully understand these things. The IP is so secret. Of course, Anthropic accidentally leaked a ton of its code recently.
Yep.
So it's not always completely secret. There are open source models. There's things like that. But, it's not like you can just sort of look at an equation and and it's certainly not like someone like me can look at an equation. I can look at the RAND equations, which, are available, they're published, and understand some things I struggle with a little bit, but mostly you can understand how these things work. You can't look at, a million lines of code or billion lines of code or whatever it is in a generative AI model and really understand it. So it's tough to fully understand things, but I think that the principles of these things many of which are not database but are human based, are going to be the same. I think that that's one of the things that we're looking at. So like I talked about in the book, there's sort of like these four major systems failures that models are prone to. It's flawed assumptions, bad data, political influence, and a tendency to sort of cut corners when something is too difficult to model. All of that stuff still applies. Political influence, obviously a big deal. We have, that is, there was talk of LLMs were too woke. Then there's talk of, so we need to restrict them so that they're not too woke. And then there's, of course, Anthropic and the Pentagon have gotten into these things. There's states are trying to regulate AI. And then, but a lot of the executive branch is saying, nope, states can't do it. It's a federal matter. So obviously that's the case. Bad data is obviously always an issue. Flawed assumptions about how systems work. All these things are sort of baked into these things and create a lot of risk around these things. And essentially what you have is AI making decisions. That's really where it comes into me, is not AI as idea generator. It's incredibly good idea generator, compiler of facts, stuff like that. But when there aren't humans in the loop making final decisions about things is where things really get dangerous in any sort of scenario. And that's kind of where, I think that and again, we don't entirely know how these things work all the time, particularly classified government stuff, but all these things are there, to have these same kinds of problems.
Yeah, it's interesting that you said that decision point, because what I'm finding is in my own adoption of AI, where I am still the decision point and the human in the loop in whatever it is that I'm having my AI agents work on, I still find that I'm the bottleneck. So I may say, hey, agent, that's the chief of staff agent, go out and get a report from everyone in the company. And I may say, hey, coding agent, go out and build this thing that I want you to build. Or I may say, hey, marketing agent, go out and make a bunch of new images for our campaign. But then it all has to come back to me, and I need to make a decision, and then I need to take it to the next step. And if I get sick, or if I am tired, or if I'm distracted, then I can't move forward. And so it does feel like the natural evolution would be to move to, okay, when you're done, decide for yourself. Like take what you've made, figure out what the best picture is if you're the marketing agent, and then go publish it. And I think that parallel is scary, because that's where we start getting into, okay, now the models are deciding for themselves what should they show. And we're hoping that between their reasoning and their memory and all the other add-ons that we've added, that they can make a good decision. But I think in the case with this, like the Rand Corp, we may run into a similar decision, right? Wherever we are putting these high leverage decisions, if we're letting AIs determine them, then I think we have to be at least willing to live with some of the consequences of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that's not to imply that somehow human decision making is always perfect. I think, as all of us would,
Right.
But ultimately, I think that there is sometimes a disconnect between autonomy and decision making and responsibility and consequences. That is a big part of it. Like at the least, that the CEO of a company, the marketing director of a company, they are going to bear the consequences of mistakes. You could probably insert an office joke about, their employees, well, maybe not them, they're the heads. But there's going to be some level of accountability on that front. AI isn't really an entity. It doesn't really have, there's arguably there's a level of self-preservation that it will engage in. That's like, these things start getting sort of like philosophical and things like that. But, ultimately, when you have a disconnect between the people who are, or the people or the thinking machines or whatever it is that are making decisions and who's going to bear the consequences, that's when you have problems, because the incentives are messy. Yeah. This is why we believe in democracy here in America, is that, the Sun King doesn't really bear the consequences of his own decision. He lives in a palace either way. He has no informational feedback loop to determine whether or not that new, agricultural policy is putting more food on the table or less. He still has plenty, regardless. You want these information feedback loops and accountability feedback loops. And I think that becomes really difficult to do the more and more that these things are disconnected.
Okay, so you mentioned a term that I wanted to dive in a little bit. He said policy feedback loop. So this is regulators and government giving feedback based on the advancement of AI in our use cases, or does it mean something different?
Well, I mean, it can just be straight up economic is another one, that is sort of because if you know, there are inefficiencies in all markets, but if you treat your customers poorly, and this is not a monopolistic setup where they have no other options, they will leave.
Mhm.
That's, I mean, it's a pretty straightforward sort of thing. And we see this all the time with, all kinds of businesses. You don't treat your people well, they'll leave, be that employees or investors or, client customers, et cetera. I think that so that in theory, and that's why democracy and capitalism are so closely linked. I mean, people talk about like the American Revolution as a democratic revolution, and it is, but it's also a capitalistic revolution. It's the small businessman here in Boston, know how to run my shipping business. What's the King of England got to do with it? Like why is he making policy on things like that? I can't vote for or against him. I can't vote for or against Parliament. I'm better informed. And so I think so the more and more disconnect you have between these things, the more and more problems you're going to get, because you don't get new data on what isn't working. Because people are, the decision makers are insulated from it, be those humans or, sort of systems, machines that are doing the sort of deciding. I mean, that's very like high concept and sort of fifth grade civics class. But I think that those sort of, in a time of constant modernization and evolution, where the tendency is to think, people were idiots back in the day, they couldn't do anything right. I think it's important to remember some of these things, because I think we risk sort of gutting systems and protocols for a lot of this stuff. Again, like regulators can go too far, and over concern with safety can actually result in downsides. I mean, like it's interesting, the abundance agenda that like Derek Thompson has written about. There's a lot of things. Ezra Klein is interesting because like sometimes regulators are trying to keep people safe from buildings falling down. It might result in not enough buildings getting built and now people are homeless. Like that, these are the trade-offs that you're constantly facing, and it's really difficult. But the more and more that it's opaque and it's unclear how these connections work, the more and more problems you have in them. And that it holds true for before generative AI came along, we had sentencing guidelines that are being used and by judges, most of which have proven to be pretty poor models. We have generative AI doing similar things, and a lot of these are really shaky. You don't know how these models are because people just don't understand them. The regulators, the judges, it's just sort of, it's this hope that something is going to give them clarity and guidance. And all the better if you can blame the machine and not yourself.
So that's an interesting point. So do you think that the AIs will be kind of a scapegoat? So as you play these scenarios out, and say something catastrophic does happen by putting decision making onto an AI, will it kind of be, hey, I'm not responsible for that, like Anthropic is responsible for it? Or do you think we have a legal and regulatory framework that would still leave the party that wrote the prompt or designed the agent to be responsible ultimately?
Well, I mean, unless the sort of public relations game fundamentally changes, people are definitely going to be blaming somebody else. I think that's a human tendency always. I think it's only gotten worse with it in sort of modernity. I don't see, we don't see consequences for executives in the ways that we used to. There's that's kind of, that's maybe a little here and there, but like we see, for example, a lot of tech regulation, for example, social media companies are not responsible for things posted on their site. You can't sue them the way you could sue the Washington Post for libel. That's an abdication of responsibility. You can argue that it's a reasonable one. It was good for development, all these sorts of things, but that is an abdication of responsibility. Hey, not my problem. And I think the same way with generative AI, I think you're going to have like, oh, well, the model made a mistake. I think when you see it is when I always say like, oh, if you are not responsible, does that mean you're giving the money back? Is often an interesting question. If the model's responsible for the mistakes, are you giving all the cash to the model? Does the model own 25 homes? These are that's where you start to get to this thing. And I think because once again, the risk and the reward not being aligned is where these things sort of come in. So yes, I think obviously the tendency people are going to have is to blame somebody else, something else, be that an underling or an equation. The hope is that the regulatory and sort of, sort of framework gets to the bottom of it, and whether or not these things, whether that's actually the case or not. But we're not exactly hiring lots and lots of regulators to handle AI at the moment. Like federal government is saying, or the executive branch is saying, that actually states can't regulate it. Like that's, now that we'll see where that all shakes out. But that's and again, I'm not exactly, I'm wearing a weird hat here, being like Mr. Pro Regulator here. That's not my usual default setting. But I think that these systems exist for a reason. And the way we're going to, and it's to prevent catastrophe, because the way that these regulations came along was catastrophe. We didn't really have labor codes until the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire. We didn't really have housing codes until, Jacob Riis and How the Other Half Lives, these pictures of the slums and things like that. We don't have systems to prevent things until the bad things happen. And I think that the sort of the catastrophic nature of AI and these sort of like cascading network effects that you have with all of these tightly allayed systems, which we see in economics all the time now with, a shipping channel gets changed and there's chaos in the fertilizer industry in ways that no one would have expected. COVID happens and all these, like all these distribution chains get messed up. There's all of these complicated relationships that we have. And, I'm sure that we're going to run into all kinds of systems failures, from AI in many ways. And hopefully they're not existential. But, I think, unfortunately, that's what it takes to create smart regulations and rules sometimes.
Yeah, that you highlighted an important thing. So, many times, actually, I think every time, regulation comes out of as some kind of necessity, post catastrophe, a black hole or a loophole being found, and and I don't know if that's necessarily bad. I think that trying to forecast and predict where problems will happen is pretty much impossible for us. Like that the chessboard has so many pieces and we can't foresee them. But once we see it play out, then maybe we can put a regulatory framework in place. I think with AI, the hard thing is that these models went from in 2020 to being fun, and then you could maybe create a text and create a poem with them, to then it could write code that a pretty good engineer could write. Then it could do it autonomously, and then it could browse the internet, and it could do all this other stuff that are all knowledge work based tasks that it can do. And in other revolutions like the electrical or steam engine, coal power, these were definitely technological advancements, but they weren't advancements that were purposefully mimicking human intelligence or trying to perform human intelligence. So I don't think that this is unprecedented, and I wonder how we will manage it, because right now it seems like we're just allowing it to happen, and we don't have a real framework for it. And I do wonder where it will play out, or what the first thing to happen, whether it's a Iran type thing or it's a war related thing that will lead to, okay, we need to put some guardrails around this and some rules, because it feels a little bit unencumbered at this moment.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it has to do with connectivity and speed, right? You look at the adoption of the personal computer, the adoption of social media, and the adoption of AI, and it is one of these, sort of like algorithmic scale things, because such an enormous percentage of the human population has a smartphone or semi-regular access to it, and it's just there on the most used platforms, apps, Microsoft and Meta and Amazon and all these places, Google. You have all these, because people have access to it. 50 per, whatever metric you want to pick, 30% of the human population used AI way faster than 30% used Facebook or social media for the first time, way, way faster than used the personal computer for the first time. And so these things spread really fast. It wasn't like When Robert Fulton invents this sort of steam engine, right, to get back and forth between Brooklyn and Manhattan, with a boat, it wasn't like suddenly every horse in America kind of had a steam engine app attached to it or something like that. You couldn't just deploy it like software updates. And so that speed is a really big factor in all of that and how that goes. And you just don't know how these things are going to play out, and how quickly they're going to go. That said, I mean, I think it's also important to remember, though, when you're talking about this kind of scale and government action, that like there are no optimal situations or decisions. Everything's varying degrees of suboptimal. Everything is imperfect. You think about something like fertilizer and insecticides. The data is pretty clear that consuming a lot of stuff covered in fertilizer and insecticides is not particularly good for you. You're better off having less of it. The data is also very clear that if it weren't for insecticides and fertilizer, we'd have like half the human population we have right now. There just isn't enough arable land without these aids to grow enough crops to feed everybody. And so that's so you're weighing things of like, we do know that it does cause cancer, or all these sort of health outcomes that we have usually down the road, and things like that, versus like starvation's pretty instantaneous, a month or two. These are, so like there's always this balancing act that needs to happen with developments and things like that. I think of Edison, right, who was there's a great movie, The Current War, writer Michael Mitnick, about Edison and Westinghouse. Edison is the direct current guy. We don't use direct current. Direct current wouldn't electrocute you. It had a massive upside with regards to safety versus alternating current. But you also needed a power plant like every mile and a half to actually power things, because the degradation of it was so significant, and AC doesn't work that way. And so like eventually a decision was made that, yes, it can kill you. And we've decided that is a risk that is worth taking. The same way we took risks when we, hunted mastodons or, sailed across the seas or any number of things. And so like, there's always this balancing act. There is no utopia available on either side. But the speed and the potential sort of scale and network effect of what's happening now is pretty unprecedented. And human brains not awesome at dealing with unprecedented situations. We tend to fall back on old models and things like that.
That's completely true. And I guess we got about 5 minutes left, but I want to make sure that the audience has a chance to ask any questions, so they could drop those in while we're talking about this. While I'm waiting for those questions to come in, something you said really did pique my interest. So one of the things that's been the case in manufacturing and construction actually for decades now is that there is a staffing shortage. So they can't find enough capable people to do the work that's required to build our buildings, produce our clothes and other items. And so, AI, especially robotics and embodied AI, is seen as maybe a solution to this problem. But to your point, there's always a choice between bad and worse, because okay, maybe you allow this AI to go and be robotic, but what does that do to the rest of the workforce? How do we take the gains from filling in this void of employees and not also just topple over the whole industry? And there's never any good answers, right? It's like we could live in a time of inflation forever where everything's expensive because we can't produce it, or we could try to use robots and produce it cheaper. But then if we do that, then maybe we'll just only have robots doing manufacturing, and we have to 13% of the GDP, you'd have to figure out how to like reorient, and there's just no good choices, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, construction is a really interesting industry in that way, right? Where, like obviously there's elements of automation and things like that happening all the time. The other day I was, I did not have my concrete mixers busted. So we were, I was using some hand drill and spade stuff to pour. It wasn't much concrete, so it wasn't that much work. There are lots of things that have been automated in the industry, but by and large, it is still a largely manual thing, nail guns and things like that aside. And I think that obviously there's things that can be done there, robots that are doing work. That said, I'm always a little concerned when the answer is, let's make fewer competent humans.
Mhm.
I think that that's both because I think it's risky and you don't know how expensive these things are going to get, and all these sorts of things. And second, because when you tear apart infrastructures, they're incredibly difficult to build back up. That's like that is where where you have these big problems, and it doesn't seem like humans are doing great in this era of incompetence. People don't know how to fix their cars. They don't know how to build things. They don't know how to they don't know how to cook their own meals. All of these things that I think derive deep psychological satisfaction for people. The less, the easier and more frictionless life seems to get, people don't seem happier. And unhappy people are a recipe for disaster. They're dangerous politically. They are the seat of instability. The old Ernest Hemingway short story collection, Men Without Women. It's about guys adrift in life and they're not making good decisions for themselves or anybody around them. And I think the more and more that we say, let's just rely on this other thing, let's be less and less capable and competent ourselves, because I think we should be teaching more and more trades in schools. That was, they're good jobs. They are hard to automate. And I think the level of satisfaction and sort of pride that you get from, things like that. I'm a big, I used to be an archery coach. I'm a big bow hunter. The level of satisfaction that comes from hunting with a bow, and butchering your own turkey or deer or antelope or something like that. That meal tastes really, really, really good, even though I'm not that great a cook. These things are different. I think they're important. And I'm veering into the sort of philosophical and things like that. But these days, I think these questions, you have to think about these things with everything, because it's such a moment of sort of psychological and philosophical morass and really despair for a lot of people. And I think that these questions are inseparable in certain ways.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it doesn't look like we got any questions, but we are at time, so I will wrap us up. And I think that this was just a great opportunity to catch up with you and talk back through your RAND and kind of how that impacts today, and how artificial intelligence, especially large language models, generative AI, are impacting us today. Joe, thank you again for coming back on, and thanks everyone for joining as well. And I hope everyone stays safe.